As a 2016 presidential candidate, I want to reply to the remarks of Barack Obama in the AME Baptist Church in Charleston with a few brief remarks and observations. I'm a candidate with the Minnesota Independence Party, Steve Carlson, to Barack Obama as president. First of all, you declared of the Christian martyrs that they did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. Now this shows that you do not wish to understand or be respectful of a church or these martyrs. You're trying to advance your own political agenda. This is not in the manner of MLK or Clementa Pinckney. I do not offer my own reply in order to judge or condemn you, but to offer a different interpretation that you and others, I hope, could benefit from. Nowhere in your remarks do I find the words God's will. Instead, you seek to appropriate and redefine God's grace, really to convince people that you know God's will, and that under your interpretation of God's will, which we find in the Holy Bible, which you never mention in the church, we have to be worthy of God's grace, as you have just redefined it. Just as you redefine marriage and families to create homosexual units who will receive children by adoption or by earlier marriages. And you have a Supreme Court that you basically stacked and pressured and weakened, and this court backs you. But God's will never changes. Essentially, you're teaching people not to believe in God's grace. And you use Pinckney's own eulogy to discredit God and discredit Pinckney, and to substitute your own demagoguery. Again, I am not trying to condemn you. I am trying to open up for you another path, another way to see the object of your eulogy, and realize what God's grace might actually mean. You say Pinckney, quote, believed in things not seen, better days ahead, off in the distance, unquote. Better days ahead, off in the distance? Do you think when George Washington led the American Revolution that God's grace in helping him was better days ahead, off in the distance? No, it was an ever-present help supplying all his needs. This is what Pinckney believed, and his needs were supplied. And it wasn't just for God to use Pinckney. He bestowed blessings on that man and all the martyrs. And that is why they were there at this community center and the church. And you should stop redefining everything according to your own willfulness and motivations, and start to open up and learn and listen. You say Pinckney persevered knowing full well he would not receive all those things he was promised, that he was helping to deliver a better life for those who follow. To be an object in your rhetoric and politicization of race and region, to stir up violence and insurrection for your political tools, and obviously taking away the ability of Americans to defend themselves with gun control while you are playing dictator, is part of your purpose in this speech. Pinckney wanted and got a rich life. He achieved power. He achieved leadership and experienced God's love. He received beyond his expectations. And this happened in South Carolina, in a former slave state, which is now free. I think these are the verses that Pinckney would have wanted sung by that slave trader John Newton, who penned this earnest hymn, Amazing Grace, not just about blindness and being lost and found. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear until in the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. 'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be as long as life endures. Yea, when this flesh and heart shall fail, and mortal life shall cease, I shall possess within the veil a life of joy and peace. A life of joy and peace. This is God's promise fulfilled here. You go on to observe that in the state where Pinckney served as a senator, kids can still go hungry and the sick without treatment, and that because of circumstances, Pinckney failed at winning more resources for his constituents and in his calls for equity. You could not see the success of Pinckney. You could only see liberalism stymied. You see socialism simply using the state to provide material wealth and equity as a goal. Just like you would seek to divide and actually undermine the country on this church stage, you labor to divide and undermine the churches themselves. Like all materialists and communists, you describe the place of the church to let Pinckney imagine what might be. Truly, the opiate of the masses, as Karl Marx so often said scornfully. And saying it nice doesn't make it less scornful. You then said black churches don't make distinctions between politics and religion. Churches, you say, should demand deeds from the state and collective salvation, that is, communism, and the power to impose the imperative of a just society. Yours is a utopian view. Your view will draw attacks from the IRS, your friends and allies. What you did not say was that you are involved in destroying the church, in bankrupting the Catholic Church, and using the force of the state and the courts to take away rights of marriage in the church, and persecuting those who want to exercise their freedom of conscience and promote only holiness in marriage. Or that your followers, like Scott Dibble in Minnesota, want to limit the churches to the walls of their sanctuaries. And you position black churches because that is what you focus on, not black Christians being killed today in Africa by your ideological and religious allies, not multiracial churches and denominations throughout America who are under attack because they're churches, not because they're black. You position them as political players historically. You are creating a hostile world for all churches today and for Christianity today through your actions. The church, you say, is the center of African American life, as if you welcome racial segregation. What we call our own in a hostile world, a sanctuary from hardships, hush harbors for slaves to worship, praise harbors for freed descendants, a way station in the Underground Railroad, bunkers for foot soldiers of the civil rights movement. Are these churches isolated charities demanding collective justice? No, what they try to do is to help each other in the grace of God, in the charity of God. Faith demands deeds. Does that mean bowing to your ideas of collective salvation? And what is that? And it's not a sanctuary from hardships. People have lots of hardships in the church. And what they try to do is help each other in the grace of God, in the charity of God. Churches as bunkers? Well, against the wiles of the devil, yes. But how about a protector, a doer of good deeds, a center of compassion and faith in God's will? Not a center for atheists and homosexuals to attack the church, attack white America and civil rights? You're inimical to civil rights. America put way too much hope in you and in the Democratic Party. And the TV networks put way too much hope in you and the Democratic Party. And we are now in a difficult position, and it requires all of us, not your single-focused mind, to provide all the answers. Your views provide no answers except war on the police, war on the South, and war on America. You admit your attacks on the Confederate flag are but a stepping stone to attack American history. You must turn back. You say the church is there to love children, feed them, keep them out of harm's way. Families, which you are tearing down with your Democratic Party, are the first line of defense for this. But hardship must be mitigated not only for children, but all people. Look at the Salvation Army. What do they do there? Look at Catholic charities, the ones that are being bankrupted by attacks by the homosexuals, Democrats, and atheists that ally with you. Catholic Charities loves all people, feeds and keeps them from harm's way, and arms them with the knowledge and grace of God. You've destroyed them. You're an enemy of churches. You used this church cynically as a forum, a stage, all the world's your stage when this arch politician is in that church. You say churches tell children they are beautiful, smart, and they matter. Well, God created all people to be beautiful, to be smart, and they do matter. That's because He created them. Not because Barack Obama says so, not because people are told that only in the church. It cannot be limited to the sanctuary. It needs to be given to all people throughout the world to spread the gospel, the one that you fight against and now pretend you know, but you do not know it. You talk about the black church. Well, what about the black churches over in Africa? People who are being beheaded, burned, raped, robbed, and eliminated by Muslims who you support in many ways. What about the Christians across America? Because of your dreams of your childhood, you believe you can attack the Christian church. The Christian church is not a black church, it's a universal church. It was Christ who went to all the nations, not Barack Obama. You still have not gone to all the nations with any gospel. In fact, you blame the gospel, blame Christ. The dignity of the people is inviolate there. Well, yes, God gives us dignity through the church. The AME church, you say, was, quote, built by blacks seeking liberty, burned because they sought to end slavery, to end laws that banned all black church gatherings, that is, all black church gatherings, in defiance of unjust laws, dismantled Jim Crow, and that blacks, Christians, and every American worked there for expansion of human rights, dignity, from liberty and justice for all. But liberty in the constitutional sense was not what the blacks who built that church originally were seeking. They were just seeking to get away from slavery. And that's not what liberty is. Liberty is what we have in our Constitution, and we must seek liberty together as a people. Liberty is our Constitution protecting us against the government, not just going into a church to hide or get away from the evils of slavery. Blacks in Africa created this slavery, which found its way into the United States from the trade of people like John Newton, who learned that God's grace is still there for him. And it was there for Clementa Pinckney, and it's there for Barack Obama, and for everybody. But white abolitionists began to free these blacks from slavery on moral grounds, not a hostile world. Slavery is evil and constrictive, and whites led the abolitionist movement, often inspired by slaves themselves, like Frederick Douglass. Ultimately, under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln, this exploded into a civil war. Freedom came, and a demand for the Constitution to reach its full promise. You say the killer imagined he would incite fear, recrimination, violence, suspicion, and would deepen divisions dating back to the nation's original sin. Well, given that psychotropic drugs were often offered to the killer, it's hard to know what the killer imagined. But if we're talking about the original sin, it originated in Africa, in a system of slavery built by the Muslims. And that system of slavery is still going on. And you support this even as Muslims kill Christians around the world. But these barbarisms stop progress, which can only be attained by freedom of conscience and living responsibly and equal opportunity, and by living out the U.S. Constitution and the Bible, on which our representatives place their hand when they're sworn in. I believe you placed yours there. And Roof, the killer, was also upset by the violence incited by you across the country. And although you hide this today, your allies have been in South Carolina threatening to carry out to finish the violent mayhem intended by the slave uprising, which was begun at this church. This kind of thing will stop progress. Progress is not you as a lone wolf in the White House with the executive bureaucracy behind you. God works in mysterious ways, you say, saying Roof was used by God. Well, that is crazy. The question is, who is Obama being used by? By God, or one who believes he is God's equal? Was grace surrounding Pinckney? I agree with that. He was a humble man. He talks about grace. You talk about grace, and you begin by talking about Roof like a dog, like he's a stray dog, invited to church. And I agree that it appears it was the love of God, the desire to share God's love, the Christian gospel, that caused Pinckney to open the doors. They didn't sense the danger. They were simple, good people trusting in God to protect them from evil. But they were in the center of the history of America. And it is critical now that South Carolina continue to advance. And we must all strive together for this. Not use the South Carolina Confederate flag to get at American history. You call for big-hearted generosity, thoughtful introspection, self-examination rarely seen in public life. I agree, but this goes for you, your party, the insurrections, the attacks on cops, on the South, on white people. These must meet thoughtful introspection, and so I want to bring this up seriously as part of the 2016 campaign. If you can change your spirit with God's grace from one of hate to one of love and compassion and even wisdom, this will set a powerful example, and you will finish your term as a true leader. Hallelujah. You seek the power of God's grace. But by your fruits, we know that you do not presently represent anything about God's grace. You are not the genuine article, but you're winging it, faking it. You admit that youths are full of hatred, and you should think about that and how you might be contributing to it. For those youth who look up to you and give you credibility because of your educational opportunities and the responsibilities that have been granted to you by the United States. Those are teaching people. And America itself has been bestowed with God's blessings, including the slaves, including us all. God set up certain laws which we face, and we have sought a bounty by following his laws. Unfortunately, in the agriculture business of the South, these weren't things that you could eat. They're basically sugar from the West Indies, which is really a drug, cotton for people to wear things, tobacco to smoke and abuse, and ultimately a leading killer. No kind of real food stuff that could support humanity, and that's a problem. And they brought in slavery to make money. And a lot of this stuff was sold all over Europe because they were taking the crops of the Indians and they were turning it into a substance that could be abused and sold throughout the world. And for that, they brought in slaves. But otherwise, in many ways, Americans have prospered because we have sought the favor of God, not through merit, but because we sought the will of God. Nowhere in this church speech do we find the will of God. Only the ambitions of Barack Obama, your willfulness and promises, while you disparage the imaginary faith, you say, and unfulfilled promises, you say, of the slain martyrs. And there is inequality alongside opportunity and alongside God's grace in America. You can't just end differences and inequality by slamming on the pulpit. We need to work within the Constitution, and we need to extend rights to all people and expect them to participate, to reciprocate. Now you say grace is not earned, merited, nor deserved, and I agree. But then you say we have to earn it by being worthy according to your ideas. Americans believe the nation was founded by God's grace, so we're very familiar. And those who are not simply don't get America. Nowhere in this speech do you hear the phrase, the will of God. Instead, we get your promises and purported commands. You said, we must prove ourselves worthy of this gift. It's amazing how cynical even this hardened leftist politician can be. You refer to pain the Confederates stirred in many of our citizens. You admit the flag did not cause these murders, but you say it's always represented more than ancestral pride, a snide remark expected from you. Then you cite blacks and whites who believe that it's a reminder of systematic oppression and racial subjugation. Well, what else, like the American Constitution, can this flag remind us of? These are not chopped liver. It's got 13 stars for 13 colonies, and it's got an ancient Scottish design that many southern states have, because indeed that is related to a very present ancestry in the South. But now you're appropriating all the good that this flag and Constitution have accomplished and pretending you did it all. It was not done by these people. They have not created this opportunity for you. But we all know that's not true. and I urge you to reverse course. If we could see the grace of God working in your life, that would change so many lives. It would give you entree to the whole people who would work together to break down these barriers that you cite and to truly transform America. But you attack the South. You attack other people's ancestors as being racist, as being killers. Well, this has fallen on the South. But in 2015, we have you in the White House, and you come up with a new idea, that slavery is wrong? Really? Isn't that obvious? How can you insult America's intelligence by pretending that you're explaining to us that slavery is wrong? And this is your idea in the Church of God. Now, a lot of people weren't involved in slavery, but just wanted the Constitution to work, people in the South. But to attack other people's ancestors is systematic oppression. Now you attack guns, and in so doing, you're attacking America's freedom. You abuse the power of your office to seek to inculcate fear. The same as in Kenya. That's just what they call politics there. And in the Middle East. And this is something the Europeans have achieved that you should learn from. They had more powerful weapons. And when they fought each other, it was more dangerous. They inherited war from the empires of Greece and Rome and other world empires. And there were many armies and guns. This came from Europe. And because of this, they had to learn to make decisions to transition leadership without violence. This is what democracy is all about, where it came from. It's not something for you to use to break down the system and ignore the Constitution. The Constitution is very important to transition leadership based on the people's will. Now what you're doing, you say that you're attacking American history, that it reminds it of. Now, you're lighting up the White House with garish colors while perverts parade in the streets. All of this perversion in front of the world, shaming our country in front of the entire world, more than Bill Clinton did. You're a systematic oppressor and a hater. The original subjugation in this slavery was blacks subjecting blacks in slavery, which was practiced because they did not have that Christian love for each other. And the international system of slavery was also carried on by Muslims, including enslavement of many whites, including Russians, Poles, Ukrainians, out of the Crimea, in the harvest of the steppes, until the Muscovites, the Russians, came down and eliminated them from the country, eliminated that enslavement. Perhaps you wish to bring that back, do you? Well, you're keeping people racially oppressed, separated, segregated, because you can't do things. We need people to take advantage of the opportunities available to them and work together. And in order to do that, you have to stay faithful to that working together and what is real opportunity, and not ever pretend that you are doing something good for this country. In fact, it appears that you're a corrupt individual who is a role model for others to be more corrupt. The grace of God does not show clearly in you. It does show in Pinckney. If you would change, it would show and it could promote to the healing of this nation. Contribute, and that would be your legacy. God's grace allows us to come together to heal our wounds. And to do that, we need to follow the 10 Commandments. It says, "Thou shalt not covet." You cannot be motivated by ethnic hatred and jealousy. "Thou shalt not kill." And somehow atheists and others fight putting this up, even Jews, whose God this is, in public places. Let's look at merit. Look at opportunity, because nobody benefits when chaos and disorder occur. Bankers do. Those who bankrolled weapons for the North, and probably the South too, yes. In the Civil War, they benefited from selling and trading in weapons. And then they established new banking laws, allowing them to ignore the misery of debt and usury when they turned to it for unethical profits. But capitalism itself does need order, needs bonds of society. And you need to actually promote this as a whole and not act along racial lines. And for that, we need the Constitution. We need to adhere to the Constitution. When it's gone, the document that constitutes the country is gone and would be replaced by only your ideas. We cannot allow you to do that. You cannot tell us how to express God's grace. Even if it was in you, it would still come from God, not from your words. And then, now you're saying that God's grace is forcing South Carolina to take down its Confederate flag as, quote, just one step in honest accounting of America's history, a modest, meaningful call for so many unhealed wounds. It's a small price to pay, isn't it? Violating the Constitution and forcing a state with the executive branch to take down their flag. And the Civil War is over. And you're really attacking white supremacy. But white people do not need to be supreme to carry on our way of life. I don't think any of the peoples in this country need to be supreme. In fact, anybody being supreme is going to get in the way of anybody carrying on their way of life. And our way of life cannot include slavery, not in America. That was wrong from the beginning. We tried to exclude this evil of African origin from the Constitution as a whole. We failed, but began abolition, and unfortunately a civil war was required, because rich lawyers and landowners interpreted away all the natural law from the Constitution to allow the money-making to go on. And the humanity and dignity of many white people was not respected either, and for you to ignore that is racist. Let's stop being racist. You don't want an inquiry. You want to get on a megaphone blaring out all of these judgments. And your real attack is that America, not the South, not South Carolina, must honestly account for history. So you'll be trying unconstitutionally to alter the American flag because you refuse to follow the Constitution and make it work. And you see a lot of your followers burning and stamping on the American flag. This is not a good way to lead, sir. But you say, by taking down that flag, we express God's grace. And you warn that God doesn't want us to stop there. We must not be blind to past injustices that continue to shape the present. Let's get into the blame game, you say. You claim to be able to address tough questions, such as, why are we permitting so many children to languish in poverty, to attend dilapidated schools, and grow up without prospects for jobs or career? And who's causing some of our children to hate? You need introspection. Why do we have the poor with us? Maybe it's so we can exercise compassion. Let's maintain those institutions that allow us to do that. It was Jesus who said, the poor will always be with us. And you should see the schools that white Americans had. One-room schoolhouses with all the grades together. They built their own buildings, or as Lincoln did, studied in front of his fire in a log cabin. Dilapidated. They were not high-class schools. There's a lot of failures in education, and that needs to be addressed. But you can't just stop learning because your school has a brick missing. People who really want to learn don't need the world's best schools. They just need a dedication to learning and inquiring into the truth and in becoming our best selves. All of us need to do that. Now, you went to a private high school and you indulged in drugs, homosexuality, you hung out smoking cigarettes and learned how to act like a gangster, and you did that in a private school. So maybe if you had been in a more dilapidated school, you might have turned out differently. I agree we need to create jobs. You cannot condemn a whole class of people based on race to not have jobs and career prospects. But first, you're promoting an employee mentality. We don't need more leaders with an employee mentality who think that they're just training people to fill jobs. You have to get people to invest, identify needs for goods and services, identify employees, and to fill that out, carry that out and fill those jobs. Now, how many businesses could be started of all kinds to help the people and the community? But what happened to the business owners we saw in Ferguson, Baltimore, or in past years in Los Angeles, who started those businesses? Your AME church was not just imagining. They were creating, through faith, those prospects which you deny. They need to compete, these businesses that can be formed, with the people funding your campaigns, big business, to make business better. Competition is good. And people can take those jobs and build families and work to create prospects, create education, create compassion, to fill the gap for those who lack wealth. And it's so much more valuable to build it up from the people than to be given it, to inherit it, or to buy it with gold. You say some of our youth hate. And when you have changed by God's grace, let's have that conversation about lost young men, tens of thousands in the criminal justice system, which is infected with bias. I'm aware of this. This is something that some of our courts talked about in recent years in Minnesota. And I covered it as a journalist, and I care about it greatly. And actually, the Chief Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court, Sandy Keith, told me that my work was very important. And our whole legal system is questionable. And what it is, it's a lot of the courts just want business as usual. They and the legislators and the press, they don't want to address opportunity and allow this grace of God you talk about today to work all the time, to work in people's lives. And we need our law enforcement. We need our courts. But we also need our parents. When your kids go out in the streets, they need to learn to be cautious with cops. But this is not a racial thing. This is, all people have to abide by this. So we have many parents who teach their kids, watch out for those cops because they hate black people. That's all they do. And often they teach this about white people. Well, there may be haters, but usually just not of blacks. And generally, being a hater is a very bad qualification for a cop. So don't assume that cops are haters. And so you need the community to stop your war on cops and your killings of each other, so that cops' jobs will be easier, less people incarcerated. Prisons can only be improved if the ideas of society improve. If the best ideas are ideas like yours, to use your power to attack the cops and sections of the country and people who are doing their job in law enforcement, well, people are learning your ideas. You're teaching American is bad, the South is bad, because of black slavery beginning in Africa, which grew very bad and resulted in a terrible civil war, which we've all been through. It caught everybody terribly. It's not all just about you. It's a whole situation of which you're a part. It can be a very good situation with God's blessings. So you should not use that situation in an evil way. He's talk of softening your heart. Well, that softening needs to take place much earlier than the sentencing hearing. But obviously making an example of those committing crimes is not deterring crime. So the law enforcement and legal system need to inject more justice and hope and compassion. And it needs to be responded to in kind. People not only build businesses, that's not enough. They have to have more love in their hearts, not dope, sex, lust, admiration of violence, all kinds of different sexualities you want to display. But I mean turning to meek, humble example, the meek, humble example of Christ. Or some meek, humble person, maybe Pinckney or Martin Luther King, and following that, putting down the walls of hatred and finding out what love actually is. Stop abortion on demand. Stop the perversion of marriage. Stop the abuse of the flesh and soul through drugs to profit others. There's much that we can do. We should all work together, and yes, I want to end the mass incarceration, but you also need to stop the crime. And maybe some of the people are involved because they don't see any real channels of opportunity. Maybe it's like the NFL. If you play football real well, that will get you out of here. And it's like, well, if you get involved in this crime, you can move out to the suburbs. But unfortunately, we get a lot of people going after each other. This kind of organized crime is really not a pass out. It's not going to help many people, if anybody. It can't bring happiness. In fact, jettisoning any hope for happiness is a qualification for being successful in that business. We need to change that. We need to provide real opportunity. Let boys use their minds to the max. Math and science, technology, macho things that demand courage, creativity, high intelligence, and character. And we also need to recognize the true value of womankind. And together we need to create a better society. So yes, we need to recognize common humanity, need to recognize every child of God is important, and to determine what is necessary to make real opportunity for every American. Absolutely, absolutely. And this is the only thing that's going to bring down the level of violence. Not gun control. People will seize whatever they want or can get when they have evil intent in their heart. Sometimes they can be deterred, but it's really evil intent that we need to be concerned with. And when you say, when we make a moral choice, we express God's grace, well, you contradict yourself. It's not a moral choice to change. You change because of God's grace. It's not by choice. When you look to God's will, you substitute God's will and what He wants for what you want. And it's not earned. It's something that's available. It isn't that you deserve it. It's because God wants you to have it. He doesn't expect anything in return. If you will follow His will, you will honor it because He tells you to and how to do that. And if you don't, the wages of sin are great. We don't enforce it. God enforces it. And we see it all around us today. I looked at your speech. I wanted to make these observations. I accept that the forgiveness expressed by the church in court and throughout, the forgiveness given by the family of Pinckney, and I'm sure by Pinckney himself, is something that is real. And it's what we all need to do. You need to do it. All of us need to do it. That forgiveness is really the strong message of this entire tragic and yet grace-filled event. There's a big difference so far between the previous high-profile insurrections that you stirred up around the country. And without further recriminations against those people involved in the events cited to trigger them, that's for God to judge. But there's a big difference here compared to these others, where you had parents seeking to hold back the mobs. You and the Department of Justice were spurring on. They're saying, well, violence won't help anything. Well, maybe you thought it might. But in this case, it is truly miraculous to see God work and to realize that people could be so moved to say that if I give up my forgiveness, my love for other people, I would distance myself from God's grace. I don't want to do that. No one in that church wanted to do that. There's something special about churches. It's not just another venue to compare to a movie theater or a school. A church of God is not just a school. And I hope this will lead you and other Americans to find God, to realize God is the foundation of our country. Our courts and judges and atheists and politicians and those that are consumed with passion of the flesh or rebellion, I hope and pray that they will see God through these martyrs, not through you or anything you've said or done. That even though descendants of slaves and slave owners, as MLK talked about, we will be able to see in these folks sitting down together in a church, thanking God, recognizing the content of the character that God gave them. They're not just praising God because they're no longer slaves. And this shows me that you don't understand where you are. Perhaps God can use you with a change in your life. That would have such a tremendous impact on your party, the political system, even the world, to spread the gospel across the world as this church wished to. They have joined the many thousands, even millions, who have given their lives as martyrs to spread the gospel, to carry out God's work. I urge you, Barack Obama, to join this. Stop attacking the church. Stop creating separation between the church and those it needs to help. Of course, you can't force people to be religious, but please stop holding back the work of God. Amen.